This is a very old disease. It dates back to more than 30 years ago, based on archaeological evidence. The first reports were more than 2,300 years ago among the Chinese and the Indians. Tuberculosis, in other words, is caused by a bacterium belonging to the Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex. It's more than 9 bacterium that can cause tuberculosis, but the most common one is the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. I think I've confused you a little bit, but it's okay. Just know Mycobacterium tuberculosis is the commonest cause of TB.
Right. So how, in your experience, maybe a kind of prevalence, is it probably quite easy to get someone with TB?
TB is quite prevalent, especially in lower and middle income countries. In the first world, it's not as prevalent as we are as in these areas of the world. And then there's places where TB is more prevalent than the others. It's called there are 30 countries in the world which make up to almost 80% of TB cases in the world. Kenya is among them. Others include Pakistan, South Africa, and India. Every day, about 3,500 people die of TB worldwide. And so it's a very devastating disease, but there's a cure and it's preventable.
So how does it all start? How does all this start? How does one get TB?
You get TB in various ways, but the most common form of TB, which infects the lungs, you get it through inspiring or inhaling rather droplets caused with the bacterium. So it's an airborne disease most of the time. But there are other forms of TB which may be caused by ingestion or drinking unpasteurized milk that has not been boiled from cows that are infected with TB. But that's very rare.
Okay.
Yeah, but the most common cause is the airborne, just like COVID, from sneezing, coughing. Yes, that promotes the spread of TB.
And Dr. that's interesting because the National TB, Leprosy and Lung Program tells us that about 40% of Kenyans infected with TB were undetected and thus untreated. And even in the report that we're listening to, it was also reiterated there. So 40% is quite a huge number. That would probably mean, let's say, 1 in 4 of maybe 10 people, 4 out of the 10 of them probably are infected. First off, because I mean, you've told us that would be spread through inhalation. So there are 10 people in a room. Chances are 4 people are infected with TB. Break it down for us so that, simplify for us so that we understand what these numbers really mean. Because most instances we find ourselves in large groups of more than 10. Mepanda matatu asubuhi, matatu waliamua jazani, and it's a 14-seater and there are probably like 20. You go to probably an event, there's so many people there. You can't really know who has TB, who doesn't. So help us understand what these numbers even mean.
There are 3 things here. Given that you've correctly mentioned about 40% of people have what we call latent TB infection. In layman's words, that means you have the bacterium in your system, in your body rather, but the body is able to fight the bacterium to an extent you don't show the symptoms, the so-called asymptomatic. So if we are 10 here, probably 4 of us here, as you've correctly mentioned, have the TB infection, the latent TB infection.
0 symptoms?
0 symptoms, yes.
Okay.
Some of us with the latent TB infection might progress to be symptomatic or start showing the symptoms, but that's not always the case.
So how does that happen?
That happens especially when you are immunocompromised. That means your system, your ability to fight off the pathogens or the germs, the TB bacterium is compromised. And there are risk factors for that. For example, HIV/AIDS is a risk factor for tuberculosis,
right.
Smoking, drinking alcohol, malnourished people, and that's why even TB is more common in the arid and semi-arid areas in Kenya compared to other areas.
Okay.
Overcrowding, for example, in prisons, churches, mosques, that's the areas of worships, as well as schools and barracks. Those are areas where if a person has an active TB, they are more likely to spread it to others who maybe they did not have the latent TB infection, but now, given that they've been exposed to the bacillus or the bacteria, they acquire the infection and start being symptomatic and spread it to other people as well.
Right. Allow me to break down some of this, the predictors that you're mentioning. For example, smoking, and maybe you've also mentioned alcohol
use.
Alcohol use. But then, so at what extent? Because you've made us understand that so 40% are infected, but then for you to actually now get the disease, that